Brian Castle here. I've been building software products and websites for going on 20 years now. And the last 6 years, I've been using Tailwind CSS in every single project that I work on. Before that, I used traditional CSS. I went through a bunch of years using Bootstrap. But I've always been a in the browser designer, and these days I just cannot live without Tailwind CSS. But I know that adopting Tailwind CSS is quite a journey for a lot of people, and I know that if you're new to it you've seen it, there's a lot of resistance at first. Believe me, I felt it too, right? It's so weird, it's so different, it feels uncomfortable, but then you start to accept the design patterns and the way things work in the Tailwind way. And, especially if you read their documentation, which I highly recommend, the official docs from Tailwind are just some of the best in the business. It's the best way to learn. I'm not going to actually teach you how to use the Tailwind CSS from the very basics, because you can get all of that straight from the official docs at TailwindCSS.com. I highly recommend it. So once you start to really learn the ins and outs of how Tailwind works, it's really not all that complicated. It's actually a lot simpler, I think, than regular CSS. You start to get to this level of acceptance. This is a new way of thinking, and you start to flip the way that you think about designing and building and structuring websites and interfaces. So you go from that initial resistance, like this is too weird, to acceptance. Like, okay, I think I'm getting my head around how this works. But there's still this nagging question, like, is it actually better? And once you do a couple more projects, then you start to get to this next level that I think of as like enlightenment. You start to realize like, oh, there's another level to this, and I can't even imagine going back to the old way of using traditional CSS. I'm going to talk about why that is in just a second. But first, you're probably feeling this resistance. I felt it, and I hear this from so many people who just haven't fully adopted the Tailwind CSS way of building things. You hear things like, Tailwind CSS makes my HTML look so ugly and unreadable. I mean, look at this file here. This is just an example of, like a Tailwind UI template with all these utility classes. Oh my God, what's going on here? This is like so different and so weird. Like, how do I even navigate my markup when it's got all these crazy utility classes here, right? I get it. It's a lot to get used to, but it doesn't actually have to be that way. And there are different ways of structuring things. I'm gonna talk about those in a minute. The other thing I hear all the time is, all Tailwind CSS sites, they all look the same. We heard the same thing back in the day with Bootstrap CSS sites. They all look the same, right? And we're hearing the same thing now with Tailwind sites, and you see a lot of like templates out there that do all look the same. But it doesn't have to be that way. Again, there are ways to use our actual design skills, and I believe that as a designer, Tailwind CSS really lets me flex my muscles as a designer to really craft the user experience that I want, and we don't have to adhere to out of the box template, if you will. The other thing we hear is, I constantly have to repeat my CSS classes over and over. Again, let's look at this example. Here's a list of images, and we're just repeating the same classes over and over again. You see this in like navigation menus, where each link will just repeat the same set of, not very dry. DRY, don't repeat yourself. It's a classic programming best practice. This doesn't look very dry to me, right? So it can be a lot to, this is where a lot of the resistance comes from. Again, there are ways around this. This is not actually the final and best way to structure your Tailwind CSS, and I want to talk about that. Last thing is, once you get past that initial resistance and you start to maybe accept the Tailwind way, you start to see something like this, where, I'm using that apply directive. You'll learn about that in the Tailwind docs. You can take your Tailwind CSS classes and put them into traditional CSS files using this apply method. So when you're new to Tailwind CSS, and maybe you've tried to adopt it, and you're maybe in that first few months of using it, you start using this all the time, and you start to do your Tailwind CSS classes into your traditional CSS files. And now you're just writing lots and lots of traditional CSS, maybe nesting it using Sass. And all of a sudden it's like, well, what am I even doing here? I'm defeating the purpose. I'm defeating the benefits of using Tailwind CSS by having to manage all of these long custom CSS files, right? What are we even doing here? What's the point? So that's where all the resistance comes from. But I'm here to tell you that it is worth the journey. And, after multiple years and many, many projects, software projects, marketing websites, landing pages, all of it, I cannot build a new website or a new project without using Tailwind CSS. Number one, it's obviously faster to initially build and ship something. And that's something that I care about most, is being able to put products out there to the world and being able to ship fast. Tailwind CSS is the way. And that's the most obvious benefit. I think that's even what they put right on the homepage. Yeah, rapidly build modern websites. Like, of course, it's faster to build. But I think that the real benefit is maintaining projects. If you started your project in Tailwind CSS, it is easier to maintain it over time and iterate, make changes faster. And that is so extremely important if you're running really any kind of business, but especially if you're starting up a software product or a marketing website. You're going to learn rapidly in the first few months and in the first year of your business. And so that means you need to rapidly make changes. If we're stuck in the old way of using traditional CSS, every time we need to make a change on our website, reconfigure how features work or adding new features, we always ended up having to refactor lines and pages of custom traditional CSS. With Tailwind CSS, it's simply a matter of restructuring some markup, and we can ship those changes and iterate much faster. That is my favorite benefit, and that's why I cannot go back. But another reason, of course, is consistent design. We can really define a true design system using Tailwind CSS. And I'm going to talk more about that. These days, we're all about component-based building of websites and software products. So, at instrumental.dev, my website, I have a components library made for Ruby on Rails, which heavily uses Tailwind CSS. Tailwind perfectly fits in the building approach of having ready-made and configurable components for all of the common UI elements like navigation menus and forms and settings, buttons, and any kind of features and structure that we use again and again, which tends to happen in no matter what you're doing. We now live in this like component-based building world, and Tailwind just fits perfectly with that approach. So, really this video is just here to tell you that there is another level to this. It's not just a matter of having to get used to looking at, markup that looks like this. There actually are some pro tips and some next level ways of building with Tailwind CSS. And that's what I want to share with you. There are approaches and there's some best practices and again, some pro tips that you won't actually find within the Tailwind CSS documentation. This will tell you how it all works, what you can potentially do and use when you are reaching for Tailwind CSS tools. But I want to share with you some pro tips from 6 years of in the trenches professional software development and website development. And that's why I'm introducing this free mini course. It's called Uncommon Tailwind CSS. It's all of my pro tips from over 6 years of professional web and software development. So I've got a video in there on my unique approach to making this HTML markup much more readable. In fact, it's sort of a weird approach to organizing the classes. I actually haven't seen it organized this way anywhere else. I can't wait to share that with you. How I actually write dry Tailwind CSS. That's DRY, don't repeat yourself. There are multiple methods, and it's not just about extracting classes using the apply directive. There are other ways, and I think better ways, to make sure that your code is dry and you're not repeating those utility classes over and over again for every single navigation item. I'm going to talk about my approach to designing websites and interfaces, especially around designing color palettes and how I define them and how I make them flexible with the Tailwind way of designing, and how I actually do use that apply directive in very specific, very sparingly throughout my projects. And we can still use it in ways without having to resort to the old way of piling up lots and lots of custom CSS that we need to maintain over time. Again, that would defeat the purpose of fully adopting Tailwind. There are ways to be much more efficient in our workflow and much more maintainable in the projects that we build. So I invite you to join me in this mini course on uncommon Tailwind CSS. That's where I'm sharing all of my best pro tips. You can drop your email in the form that I'm providing with this video. And I appreciate you checking it out. Of course, if you have any specific questions, feel free to reply in the comments, and maybe I will release another video on those either here on the channel or in the free mini course, which you can get right now. Thanks for watching. See ya.